On one of the latest episodes of Joe Rogan's podcast, the topic of Christianity came up again by someone who is Jesus curious, yet has trouble accepting the resurrection.
What I'm interested in, what gets me thinking is, it's very hard for me to wrap my head around the idea. I'm a Christian. I believe that Jesus rose. That's very hard for me. I just can't accept it.
Despite my expectation of Joe Rogan potentially hearing the gospel from someone that's Jesus curious, it actually went a totally different direction. And two major, bold claims were made. So I decided to get one of the smartest people that I know on this topic, Dr. Michael Brown himself. He's a leading apologist, a radio host, and holds a doctorate from NYU in Near Eastern languages and literature. So you know it's not one of those mail-in diplomas that a lot of these guys claim to have. But before we get into that, let's first take a moment and review the clips in question.
If God did at one point in time communicate to his disciples, there was no written language at the time. That when they started writing things down, they wrote things down in languages that we don't use anymore. We lost all that in the translation to Latin, to Greek, to English. Like, there's so much confusion as to what the original meaning of the word was. I'm sure you've read a tweet before that was in Russian, and then you press the translate button, and then it gives you this broken English version of what they're trying to say.
Right.
And then you have these ancient ways of describing things. It's very different the way they say things than we do. So that's open to interpretation. And then on top of that, you clearly have the work of man. Along with it there's some got added.
Yes.
And so the question is how much, because it's not zero. Never ever been a person in a position of power over a kingdom that didn't lie.
Yeah.
If they were in control of whatever the religious documents were, for sure there had to be.
I don't concern myself with those details. I think it almost misses the entire point.
I just kind of wanted to get your insight on this and how dispel some of this notion that there's impossible for people to understand the original Hebrew and Aramaic and Greek language that the scriptures were written in.
Yeah, first, I'm thrilled that Joe Rogan and his guests are talking about the Bible and talking about God. That's all positive. Yeah, to set the record straight, so my PhD is in Near Eastern languages and literatures from New York University. So I spent decades studying the original texts, Hebrew language, ancient Hebrew language, ancient inscriptions, and things like that. So first, they're quite intelligible, and it's not like you just dusted off some fossil somewhere in some script nobody knows. The books of the Bible, the languages have been read continuously for hundreds and even thousands of years. So it's not like ancient Hebrew just existed somewhere in a vacuum and now we have to decipher it. It's been read by Jewish people through the centuries. It's been translated. It's been transmitted. It's been quoted. It's been understood. You could take 10 biblical Hebrew scholars, put them in 10 separate rooms, and give them a text from the Hebrew Bible. And unless it's one of the most obscure, difficult passages like you have in all literature, everyone's going to come up with basically the same translation. It's not mystical. It's not mysterious. The same with Greek. We have many ancient translations of these things. We can compare them to modern translations. So I can read biblical Hebrew better than I can read a modern Israeli newspaper. And it's easy. It's clear. The language is understood. And look, even things that have been discovered, ancient inscriptions from thousands of years ago, we can decipher them. We can understand them because you have sister languages too that have been spoken and used the whole time. So it's a science and it's easily done. It's not a mystery, which is why if you'll take 100 different Bible translations and look at most passages, they're pretty much going to tell you the same things.
Where do you think they got this notion that it is impossible to understand? And Joe Rogan's made this claim multiple times, and it seems like it's a stumbling block for him to approach the scriptures and to receive what the scriptures testify, ultimately all testifying and pointing to the God-man Jesus. How do you think he came to these conclusions that it's impossible, you got to just throw your hands up and say, we don't understand, and we can't know?
Look, he seems like a real common sense guy and a guy that gravitates to what's logical and makes sense. And he's obviously just heard this repeated over and over again. For example, and I don't say this to attack, again, I'm glad he's been speaking about these things. But number one, the idea that when God was communicating to people in the ancient world, they couldn't write. Well, Sumerian, the world's oldest language, goes back to around 3100 BC, so about 1500 years before the time of Moses. And Moses is in the Bible commanded by God to write certain things. Well, you had written languages already for over 1,500 years. Akkadian,
Wow.
which is massively attested, that was around for over 1,000 years. Egyptian hieroglyphs, those are around for roughly 1,500 years when God commanded Moses to write. That's one thing. A second thing is that oral traditions are very, very pervasive in parts of the world to this day where things are passed on. If I start singing the ABCs, A, B, C, D, Q, Z, it's like, no, everybody knows it's wrong because you've heard it over and again. So that's the other thing. Things were transmitted orally. And then when it was time to write them, there were written languages ready, accessible. So when God tells Moses, write these things, there were written languages available. And there were forms of Hebrew that were available to write. So that's one thing. There's this, it's kind of a meme that the Bible that we have today is translations of translations and translations. You can't understand it. And that just gets out in the air and people think it's true. And in fact, it is simply an internet myth. I'll give you another example. Joe Rogan said with ancient Hebrew that the letters are also numbers. So you've got numerical value. Again, not to attack, but a completely bogus misunderstanding of things. First, the letters, the Hebrew letters, were not used as numbers until about 300 years before the time of Jesus. And that was following the example of Greek. But it's not that every letter has a numerical value in a sentence. No, in a sentence, it's a letter. Have you ever heard of Roman numerals? So the L means a certain thing, the V means a certain thing, the C means a certain thing. That doesn't mean when you're reading something in English and you see the word L-I-V-E, oh, L must be a number. No, that's a sentence with letters. So the same way, the Hebrew Bible is letters and sentences. The idea that these were also used as numbers where you're using numbers, like the year 1982, right? That doesn't even come in until after the Old Testament is completely written. And there's not a single time in the Hebrew Bible where the letters mean numbers. So again, it's a misnomer, it's a misconception, but it's out there. And in point of fact, we have carefully preserved manuscripts for centuries. The biblical books are the best preserved books from the ancient world. The New Testament is far and away the best preserved book from the ancient world. Hebrew scribes over the centuries copied things meticulously. These were considered sacred words, and people passed them on, learned by them, lived by them. And I can assure you, you read the 10 Commandments, you get 10,000 people who can read biblical Hebrew, write out the 10 Commandments. There's no ambiguity. Lo tin af means don't commit adultery. Lo tirtzach means don't murder. You know, it's there it is. Honor your father and mother. There's no ambiguity. The scriptures speak with clarity.
Something that really stood out to me, and we talked offline about this, but Brian Callen, the comedian that Joe Rogan was interviewing, was saying how he doesn't believe in the resurrection.
What I'm interested in, what gets me thinking is it's very hard for me to wrap my head around the idea. I'm a Christian. I believe that Jesus rose. That's very hard for me. I just can't accept. That's not how I.
You can't accept the resurrection.
I can't.
See, that's one of those.
But
It's
that's
like,
okay.
What did they mean by that?
Because that is what the entire New Testament is about and testifying to and pointing to. What do you make of that in terms of him not believing in the resurrection when it seems like there's, if we believe these are reliable, then there's more than enough evidence for the resurrection?
Well, not just that. If there's no resurrection, there's no such thing as Christianity. There's no Christian. There's no story. There's no New Testament. There's nothing. End of subject. If Jesus doesn't rise, then everything that comes before that is invalid. And if he doesn't rise, we never probably would have heard of him. That'd be the end of the story, just another failed mission or a failed Messiah. So the resurrection is the linchpin for everything. If there is no resurrection, then Jesus is not the Savior, the Messiah, the Lord. If there is a resurrection, then he is the way, the truth, and the life, and God himself has vindicated him.
There's going to be a lot of people that see this, Dr. Michael Brown, that probably feel the way Rogan and Brian feel about this, whether it's about not being able to understand the Bible because of the older languages, or whether it's about, I just can't get behind this resurrection thing. And maybe Joe Rogan or Brian are watching this. What would be a final thought that you would leave with those people in terms of why we could stand and believe what we believed it to be true?
You know, Ruslan, if you go back 51 years when I was a 16-year-old, when shooting LSD using Jewish long-haired hippie rock drummer with no interest in God or the Bible whatsoever, you realize that I came to this kind of fresh. I grew up in a nominal Jewish home. And when I started reading the Bible, it's really the first time I had ever read it. And it was a real discovery. And then when the local rabbi challenged me about what I believe, that's when I realized I need to learn Hebrew and these other things. So it's been a lifelong journey of academic study and spiritual discovery. And what I've come to realize is that these words, Jesus says this in John 6, the words I speak to you, they are spirit and they are life. I would suggest to Joe, to Brian, to anyone watching, get a Bible for yourself. Get a New Testament and just start reading. Find out who this Jesus really is. Read his words on the Sermon on the Mount. See if they don't challenge you to the core. Read what Paul says about the meaning of love in 1 Corinthians 13 and see if that's not the most extraordinary thing you've ever read. Read what Ecclesiastes says about the meaning of life and says, is that the best expression of skepticism I ever saw? Read the book of Job and see how within the Bible there are challenges about God's justice, goodness. Read about it and see, is it relevant? Does it speak to you? Is it just some ancient book from the ancient world compiled by all these different people, these desert dwellers and these Bronze Age, misogynistic, homophobic people? Or is there an incredible revelation? Does it understand human nature? Does it understand our weakness? When Jesus says in Matthew 11, come to me, all you are weary and struggling, I'll give you rest. Is there something among such loneliness and depression and and drug abuse? Is there an invitation for us to come and find meaning and purpose and forgiveness and redemption? The call to bless those who curse us and to overcome evil with good, and overcome hatred with love. Is that something our society needs today? So I'd say just start reading. And if you're wondering, is this really accurate? Well, here's a simple thing to do. Go to BibleGateway.com, and I'm not affiliated with these things. I'm not selling something. Go to BibleGateway.com, look up your favorite verse, any translation, and then click on it. Find this in all different translations, and you'll get maybe 50 or 100 different versions. You'll see, wow, they're all pretty much saying the same thing the same way. You start to gain your confidence that these things have been passed down carefully through the ages, preserved by people who felt these were so sacred. Over the centuries, Jewish scribes developed a technique where they would copy out the 5 books of Moses, and then at the end, they would count every single verse, every single word, every single letter. This is the middle verse, this is the middle word, this is the middle letter. If it was off by one, they wouldn't use the manuscript. So these are the traditions developed by people who've taken this very, very seriously. But get an English version, something that you find readable, something contemporary, and read it and just do this. Say, God, if you're really there, or Jesus, if you really rose from the dead, would you help me to see? Yes. I'm not here to fight you, resist you. If there is more, if there's a life after death, I would really like to know. And if you put me here for a reason, I'd like to know why I'm here. And if nothing comes of it, nothing lost. But why not at least do that? Many people will go their whole lives without even reading the Bible for themselves. And there's a reason it remains the world's best-selling book to this day.
All right, Dr. Brown, thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate you.
My joy. God bless.
There you have it. Dr. Michael Brown eloquently explaining why the Bible is reliable, why we could understand it. If you want to see the extended version of this conversation completely unedited, consider signing up for our Patreon. And if you want to see me and Dr. Michael Brown addressing the mass deception that hit the evangelical community during the 2020 election, where hundreds of prophets predicted falsely that Donald Trump was going to become president, check this out right here.